Hey guys, so Joe will be coming to Reverse 999 in about 2 days, as in we can pull for him. And here I want to discuss about his kit and if you actually should pull for him. For me, I will be pulling for him personally because he brings a new gameplay, so it's refreshing in a way that I get to test out different kit with different team comp, so that makes it really exciting and for me to enjoy the game even more, so I will be pulling for him. But one thing I want to address in this video as well is since his release in the China version, a lot of people has already, a lot of people mentioned that Joe is mid, he is not as good, his kit is not great at all, which to me is not really that accurate. It just shows that you probably do not know how to use Joe, or you do not know what type of team that you should form him with, because he does have a shield, so a lot would consider him like a tank. But personally, to me, he's not a tank, he's a DPS. He cannot really tank because he died quite easily, so you need to be able to provide him some kind of support, which usually that's what you do. You have your DPS there and you bring support or sustain in order to sustain your DPS. So he does provide sustain for the team, but at the same time he does need more sustain, so you should have another sustain to sustain him. But does that make Jay a bad character? No, he still can complete fight just like any other character, and not in an inefficient way. He clears stage really fast. Just have a bit of issue with rate, but I will talk about that in the end of this video. But yes, he's a strong character, he hits really hard. So let us go through his kit and then you decide if you still want to pull for him or not. So to understand Jay's kit, the first thing that we need to know is this skill, Heat Treating. So it's a counter skill, which means after Jay casts this, he will grant the entire party a shield, and every time the shield is like, if the enemy attacks a unit with that shield, Jay will counter. And if the enemy does an AoE attack and hits several of your party members, Jay will then counter multiple times. If they attack all 4, which is usually what the enemy does when they use their ultimate, then Jay will counter 4 times. So let's assume that you are fighting against 3 enemies and the enemy attack 4 times. So you do a minimum of 4 counter per round. And each time Jay attacks, he does 30% relative damage to all enemies. So if you have 3 enemies, he's doing a total of 90% relative damage in total. And if his HP is lower, which is very easy for his HP to go down because he inflict burn on himself and he will bring his HP down, but it can't go below 15%. So you will, if you really don't heal him at all, he will be at 15% plus his shield, which actually is very risky if you want to play it this way, because if any enemy is going to hit really hard and single target on Jay, he might just die, even with his shield on. So do be careful with that. But if you look at this range, if his HP is at 15%, which means it's 80% lower than his original HP, then he gets additional 80% relative damage on his attack, which makes him attack for 110% relative damage on 1 enemy. So if you have 3 enemies, then he will be doing 330% per counter, right? So I did a calculation. He can be doing in the range of 360 to 1320% in one single use of this skill. And this is just an incantation, so it's actually pretty crazy damage output, which is why some limbo that you watch on the YouTube, that in just 2 to 3 turns Joe destroys everything, because his damage output is actually pretty insane. And that's not all. His damage also comes from his ultimate, but this one can be a little bit tricky if you want to maximize it, because if you watch some video, when they use Joe's attack, it's really weak. Alright, it's really weak. So how do we maximize this? First of all, we have to understand the burn stacks. When Joe attacks the enemies, he inflicts burn on them, and whatever number of burn he inflicts on them, he inflicts on himself. Okay? So the thing is, his ultimate states there, it deals 350% relative damage. However, for each stacks of burn, then additional 10% damage. Okay? And when you use his ultimate, Joe will inflict all of his stacks to the enemy. So the problem here is that when will this stack be gained and when will they cut by half? Because as we know, as when we were playing Isolde, at the end of the turn, the enemy's burn stack will be cut by half. Alright? So if you want to use its ultimate, which is the start of the next turn, then the enemy stack will be half. So it's very difficult for you to actually go excess, right? And assuming that in this case, Joe have 35 stacks, which if you think about it, if Joe's burn stack were to be cut by half at the start of the turn, then it's very difficult for him to gain 35 stacks. Fortunately, his stacks actually cut by half at the end or at the beginning of the enemy's turn, right? So let's say this turn you have 17 stacks, you do an attack and you gain 2 stacks, let's say you are at 20, then after that the enemy starts. So before the start of the enemy, that 20 stack will then be cut down into 10 stacks. So now it's the enemy's turn and they will attack you. Joe will do a counter attack, and if he attacks several units, he will gain even more burn stack, so that 10 will then increase. At the start of the next turn, that burn stack will maintain, right? So if you have a very good counter that turn, which means you are able to counter a lot and gain a lot of burn stack, you can carry forth all of these stacks to the beginning of next turn. So when Joe uses his ultimate, he can apply 35 stacks on the enemy, right? So we have to make sure he does counter the turn before in order to get his stack to 35. Now for the enemy, the stack has been reduced, right? We inflict maximum 30 at the end of turn, but now at the start of turn it drops to 15. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do with this. So here I did some calculation, assuming that he has 35 stack and the enemy has 15 stack, and that is the first thing you do. At the start of turn, you just use his ultimate. Then you will only have excess of 20 stacks, so overall he will be doing 550% AoE damage. And that's actually pretty huge, because if we consider other units that have AoE, like A9 is I think like 300 or 400, and then you get P1 or something, it increases a little bit more, and then Jessica is like 350 if I'm not mistaken, so 550 is actually pretty high. Okay, but if you have Isolde in your team and you are able to use some of the other units attack and inflict pre-ignition on the enemy and burn them, so by the time you reach Joe's turn and he will be using his ultimate, the enemy will have 30 stacks. Or just assume that Isolde just uses ultimate, directly inflicting 10 stacks, pushes it to 30 stacks, then now Joe uses his ultimate, where all 35 stacks on Joe will also transfer to the enemy, so you get excess of 35 stacks. So 350 plus 35 extra stat, which is another 350, you will be hitting for 700% AoE damage. And that is actually pretty crazy. Yeah, but this requires a very specific setup. So if you do it wrongly, like the enemy has very low stacks and your own burn stack is very low, and you click on this ultimate, it's not going to do damage. Okay, so be warned, don't do that. If you do need to keep it until the enemy or yourself have high burn stack, you do it. Okay, so this is regarding Joe's ultimate. So the next skill here is hardness testing. So now we know the damage is from his ultimate and his counter. So this skill, it functions more of a debuff, but actually it is a buff, right? So it is an attack, it also debuff, and it's also buff. The debuff is because it just inflict burn, but that is not the main point, because the main point is that when you use this skill, for every stack of burn that is on Joe, he will grant damage dealt up based on the number of burn stack. So if you have 35 burn stack, which is the maximum at P0, he can grant the entire party 35% damage dealt, and that is actually quite good. Okay? However, you might ask, is it easy for Joe to actually gain burn stack and up to 35? Well, that depends on how many enemies you are fighting. If you're fighting against one single target enemy, and that enemy is going to just attack 3 times, and Joe is going to counter 3 times, hitting only one enemy per time, you get just up to 6 stacks of burn, and it's quite impossible for you to stack up all the way to 35. So, what if you are fighting against, let's say, 3 enemies? When Joe does a counter attack, he's hitting all 3 enemies, he's inflicting 2 burn stack on every enemy, so all of these burn stack will be inflicted on him. So a total he can get up to 6 stacks every counter, and assuming that he's countering 4 times, he get at least up to 24 stacks. So with that, he can actually reach to 35 stacks rather easily and grant the entire party 35% damage dealt. So for his insight 1, when he's attacking the enemy, he gain attack based on 50% of burn stack. So let's say he's at 35 burn stack, then that's about 17% attack up. So do note that his burn stack, as was mentioned previously, reduced by half at the start of the enemy's turn, which means that is the time when he's doing his counter. So his first counter, he will probably just have like 7% attack up, but as the more he counter, then at the end he will be doing more damage in that sense because he will gain more attack up. But during the start of next turn, when he's using his ultimate or any other skills, then he would probably get that 17%. Again, depends on the number of enemy that you're fighting. Okay, at Insight 3, he gained immunity to freeze and cold while he's in burn status, and if his HP is below 50%, then he get another 20% crit rate for that round. So overall, he really provide a lot of buff for himself, so including the one that I mentioned before, 35% damage dealt, and then now we have 17% attack up and 20% crit rate. So yes, but Joe really needs more sustain. So healers, and actually best is someone that can reduce the damage taken by him. So character that provides sturdiness or defense up, damage taken reduction, yes, all of those will help Joe in terms of survivability. So I'm looking actually at Samurai's, Kakania, Isolde as some of the key team members for him. Now, in terms of simulating his runs, so the disclaimer here is that this may not be possible in most runs, because out of this 15 round and he's dealing a lot of damage, either the enemy is dead by then or Joe died due to being at 50% HP the entire time, because I'm calculating the maximum as if his HP is 15%. So it's very risky to play it this way. Okay, so here what I simulate is he is the main DPS, so he will be using a lot of AP. You start off with counter. So what you want to do is use his counter every turn, because that renews his shield as well, and it's very important for his shield to be up. If no shield, no counter. And then I do the attack every time I can. So here I'm assuming that I have the tuning that resets the first melody, right? I reset, so I'm able to get attack and counter all the time, and I'll be able to use it and gain Moxie, so I can use his ultimate at the end. In other runs, if you are using Joe like a sub DPS, which he's totally good at, right? He can provide some tank, shield, and then he provides sub damage. So in this case, you will not be using his incantation that often. So I would recommend Counter, you still have to use it very often, at least once in 2 rounds. And his attack as well, because his attack also buffs the party. So you want to use it once every 2 rounds, as the buff lasts for 2 rounds. So I calculated here, if against 2 enemy, and he would minimum do 4 counter, which that is not always the case, because if the enemy is doing an ultimate and hitting all 4 of your allies, he will do 4 counter immediately, right? So I would say like 4 is kind of like on the lower average, he probably will do more. But if you are fighting against a single target enemy, then he will do much less. So in my calculation, he do about 500 over 1000 damage, and that equates to about 37,000 1 round per round. And here I include Isolde here. So with Isolde, Joe will be gaining stack faster, and the enemy will have higher stacks, and I can fully utilize his ultimate for max damage. So yeah, so Isolde can tremendously increase the overall damage output from Joe. So I calculated here, total is about 700,000 damage, and that's about 49,000 damage per round, and it's crazily high. And lastly here is if against single target enemy. So I did a simulation here for single target as well, and of course in this situation his damage will drop by a huge margin. So total about 200,000 damage, and that's equate to 13,000 per round. But still, it is considered pretty high. So now we do a comparison with other characters. So we have like Spatodia with Isolde, Junyangzi, Winsong. So if you can see Joe against single target enemy, Steer does more than Junyangzi and Spatodia, which makes him actually a pretty good DPS. But if against Winsong with the new tuning, he does fall out a little. And against Lucy, obviously, then he is not as good as these 2 top DPS. But as a sub DPS, if you put it this way, he can rival even DPS. So by all means, use him as a DPS and you can still clear fights easily, even it is single target. And here if you do the comparison for multi-target, he actually out-damaged Lucy and Winsong. Obviously Winsong, but Lucy, and knowing Lucy topping all the charts, this is actually a pretty huge claim on how good Joe is. So is it really true? Well, it depends on fight. Raid, he's probably not going to function as good. And we are using Raid to benchmark most of the unit right now. So this is why that a lot of people think that Joe is not really that good. That's because when you put him in Raid, he doesn't really function as good as many other characters. So I will go into that in a moment. But do note that if you are fighting like Utu, Roguelite, and Limbo, Joe actually has the potential to deal more damage than Lucy. But again, with the right fame cards, with the right artifact, you can even defeat the final boss in just 1 round. So does it really matter, right? So anyway, going back to Raid, this is where the problem comes in. Okay, Raid, the one main problem is that when the enemy dies, they renew their HP, but they don't attack. So in those rounds during the transition, Joe will not do anything. Right? No attack means no counter. So that is a concern. So over the 30 rounds, there will be a lot of damage loss due to the transition. And we do know now that for most of Lucy's run, when she's attacking, she kills the enemy within 1 whole round, so preventing the enemy from attacking her. So the longer she can do that, the higher your score get. So like most of the raid that I do, I could reach up to 2 million score because the first 1.3 to 1.6 million, I can just outright kill the boss and it keep pushing the score forward. Joe cannot do that. Joe need the enemy to attack. And when they attack at over 1 million to 1.2 million and above, they can just easily one hit KO Joe. That's because his HP is at 15% and his shield is not like covering his entire HP. So if you don't have character like Kakanya, easily one hit and he's gone. Okay, so that is the second problem, and that is why people usually consider him as a lower rank unit. They don't put it in like high S tier. That's because he does have this weakness. You can even put him with character like 6, as 6 has defense up, and then sometimes provide him incantation might as well, which increases damage. Samawise, because his HP is low, you can get that 80% damage boost. Isolde with the additional burn stack, so he's able to sustain his own burn. And yeah, you can have another good healer like Teferi as well, for passive healing, so you can maintain his HP around 50% and not go too low, but not go too high as well. So do try it out if you're pulling for Joe. So do you need to pull for him? Well, honestly, there is nobody in reverse at the moment that you actually need to pull for, or they are must pull. Some is really good, especially those limited banners. Like coming up is Anjonala. If you want to save for her, I do understand your reason to do so, but yeah. So there is no other characters that at the moment. Most of the fight is pretty easy to do for bare minimum completion. So in that case, there is no need to pull for anyone, to be honest, right? But here I would recommend that if you're a character like Isolde, Kakanya, you probably can gain a lot from Joe and you enjoy a pretty good gameplay. And moreover, his kit is quite new in the sense that he do counter. Bebel does it, but Bebel does it like he does. So it will be more fun to play Joe if you are interested in this counter mechanics and mechanism. And the burn stack, you do need to keep track of it. So there are some thoughts that you need to put into when you are playing him. So if you like that kind of gameplay, pull for him. If you do not like it, then don't pull for him. As simple as that. So thank you for watching this video and have a good day.